The worn-out neon sign above the entrance flickered, spelling out Mystic Menagerie in faded turquoise letters. I clutched my phone. Double, checking the address for the 10th time. From inside the small building on Elm Street, a cacophony of unusual sounds bled through the thin walls. A low rumble that vibrated through the pavement. A series of high, pitched whistles, and something that distinctly sounded like a giant cricket. My gut churned with a mixture of dread and desperation. Another rejected job application meant my bank account was looking sadder than a lonely puppy. No turning back now. A rusty bell jingled as I pushed open the door, and the air immediately hit me. It wasn't the familiar scent of dog food and cedar shavings you'd expect from a pet store. This was something deeper, richer, like damp earth after a summer storm, mingled with a faint, almost metallic aroma, like ancient copper. My eyes struggled to adjust to the dim interior, and then I froze. The glass enclosures lining the walls held creatures that defied logic. In one tank, a four-legged being the size of a ferret stretched an impossibly long, slender neck, its skin a shimmering mosaic of iridescent green and gold. In another, a miniature rhinoceros, no bigger than a house cat, snuffled around, its hide covered in thick, bristly scarlet fur. I blinked, convinced my tired brain was playing tricks on me, until the tiny rhino let out a surprisingly loud, trumpet-like snort. "You must be Alex." The voice was calm, steady, and belonged to an older woman who emerged from behind the counter. She had to be in her late 60s, with a cascade of silver braids, neatly pinned up and eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing. Her movements were fluid, economical, like someone who'd performed the same dance for decades. "Yes, ma'am. Alex Miller. Thanks so much for giving me a shot." She looked me over, a faint smile touching her lips. "Eleanor Vance, and your welcome, son. Though I should warn you, this ain't your average gig." She reached under the counter and pulled out a sheet of paper, the rules penned in precise, elegant script. "Before we go any further, you gotta understand these rules. They're not suggestions, not guidelines. They're etched in stone." I took the paper, noticing how her fingers lingered on it, as if she was hesitant to let it go. There were 5 rules, clearly numbered. 1. Treat every customer with respect, no matter how wild their requests or peculiar their appearance. 2. Never ever question the merchandise, the customers, or how we run this place. 3. Refunds, exchanges. Forget about it. Absolutely none under any circumstances. 4. Those covered tanks. Don't touch 'em, don't open 'em, don't even try to peek inside. 5. Feed the creatures every night at closing, but keep your gaze down. No direct eye contact. I read the list twice, my confusion mounting with each bullet point. These are mighty specific. They have to be, Eleanor said, her tone note nonsense, but with an undercurrent of something deeply serious that made me meet her gaze. "Alex, I'm gonna be straight with you. This job pays well because it needs someone who can follow directions to the letter, no detours, no debates. Can you do that?" My desperation must have been written all over my face. My last 3 interviews had gone nowhere. Rent was due, and my landlord was already hounding me. I folded the paper, slipping it into my pocket. "Yes, ma'am, I can do that." A flicker of approval crossed Eleanor's face. "Good. Let me show you around." She led me past the first row of enclosures, pointing out each resident with casual efficiency. The miniature giraffe, which she called a pocket neck, munched on what looked like tiny, iridescent leaves. Next to it, a glass box housed creatures she referred to as fur rhinos, no bigger than hamsters, their crimson fur shimmering under the fluorescent lights. "These are our more common offerings," Eleanor explained, heading deeper into the shop. "Most folks prefer 'em. They're easier to manage." We passed tanks containing things I couldn't even begin to classify. Something that resembled a chameleon with feathers perched on a branch, its scales shifting colors with every passing moment. In another enclosure, a group of what looked like miniature horses grazed, except their manes flowed like liquid mercury, catching the light in impossible ways. "What do they eat?" I blurted out, then immediately clammed up. "Sorry. Rule 2. Eleanor paused, giving me a subtle nod. "See, you're already learning." She continued walking, leading me to the far wall where several large tanks sat, draped in thick, dark cloth. A low, rhythmic thrum emanated from beneath the fabric, almost too faint to hear, yet strong enough to feel in my chest. "Those are the tanks mentioned in Rule 4. Eleanor stated, not breaking stride. You'll dust around him during your daily cleaning, and that's it. I wanted to ask what kind of fish could produce that kind of sound, but I bit my tongue and followed her to the front counter. The register looked like something from a bygone era, big, clunky buttons, a cash drawer that opened with a satisfying "Chet-ching." Most transactions are simple, Eleanor said, running her hand along the counter's worn surface. Cash, credit cards, the usual. But some customers pay with alternative currency. She pulled open a drawer beneath the register, revealing compartments filled with ancient-looking coins, smooth river stones, and small bundles of dried herbs tied with thin twine. Don't ask about any of it. Just take whatever they offer and make change from the right section. I gawked at the idea of giving someone change in dried herbs. Eleanor closed the drawer with a definitive click and moved to a filing cabinet behind the counter. Sales records go here, organized by date. Customer info is private. You don't discuss purchases with other customers. You don't drop names, and you certainly don't gossip about what anyone buys. She pulled out a thick ledger, flipping through pages filled with neat handwriting. Every transaction gets recorded, even the ones paid for with that alternative stuff. The chirping and scratching sounds had intensified as more creatures woke up, and I found myself glancing back at the enclosures. One of the covered tanks emitted a sound like distant thunder, and I quickly averted my gaze. It's almost closing time, Eleanor said, glancing at an antique pocket watch on her wrist. You need to see the evening routine. She moved to a storage closet and pulled out a large plastic container overflowing with various kinds of sustenance. Some looked like familiar pellets and seeds, but others were unlike anything I'd ever laid eyes on, seen small cubes that pulsed with a faint blue glow, dried strips of what might have been meat but shimmered oddly, and what appeared to be miniature crystal formations. Each enclosure gets fed according to the chart by the closet, Eleanor explained, pointing to a laminated sheet covered in detailed instructions. The portions are exact, no extra, no substitutions, and remember Rule 5. She demonstrated with the first few enclosures, her eyes locked firmly on the floor as she unlatched each one and dropped in the appropriate food. Her movements were swift and precise, but what struck me was how meticulously she avoided looking up, even when the creatures inside made excited chirps and snuffles at mealtime. The trick is never to make eye contact, Eleanor said, moving to the pocket. Next enclosure. Keep your head down. Drop the food. Close the door. Move on. Some of him will try to get your attention. Ignore it completely. I watched as she fed the fur rhinos, who trumpeted enthusiastically, but received no acknowledgement from Eleanor. When she reached the covered tanks, she lifted the cloth just enough to slide the food underneath, never revealing what lay within. Your turn, she said, handing me the container. My hand trembled slightly as I approached the first enclosure. The creature inside, something that looked like a ferret with shimmering scales, watched me intensely as I fumbled with the latch. I forced myself to focus on the floor and dropped in the required portion of blue cubes, then quickly snapped the door shut. Better, Eleanor said, but faster. You don't want to give time to react. I moved to the next enclosure, my gaze fixed downwards, trying to ignore the way the creatures seemed to move differently when I wasn't looking directly at them. By the time I finished with the visible animals, my nerves had settled a bit. The routine was bizarre, but I could manage it. Then Eleanor handed me a portion of what looked like raw, glistening meat and gestured toward the covered tanks. Same process. Lift the cloth just enough to drop the food in, then cover it immediately. The low thrumming grew louder as I approached the first tank. I lifted the edge of the thick cloth, saw nothing but inky darkness inside, and quickly dropped the meat through the opening. Something splashed, and the thrumming shifted in pitch for a moment before returning to its original tone. The second tank was eerily silent when I approached it, but as soon as I lifted the cloth, something moved in the water with enough force to create noticeable waves. I dropped the food and yanked the cloth back down, my heart pounding. Good, Eleanor said when I finished the last one. You'll get quicker with practice. She helped me put away the feeding supplies and walked me through the closing checklist. Lights off, register secured, doors locked. The creatures settled into quieter evening sounds as the shop grew darker, though the covered tanks maintained their low thrum. "Alex," Eleanor said as we reached the front door. She turned to face me, her expression more serious than it had been all day. "I need you to understand something. These rules aren't just arbitrary restrictions or quaint old habits. They exist for very specific reasons, and your safety, possibly your life, depends on following them exactly." I looked back at the darkened shop, where indistinct shapes moved in the glass enclosures and the covered tanks hummed their mysterious song. "What happens if I break one?" Eleanor's face grew grim. "That depends on which rule you break and how badly. But I can promise you this, no matter how harmless it might seem, no matter how reasonable the request or how small the exception, breaking any of these rules will have consequences you can't even begin to imagine." She placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip surprisingly firm. "Tomorrow, you'll start meeting our customers. Some of them will test you, intentionally or by accident. Remember, your safety depends entirely on following the rules without exception, no matter how insignificant breaking them might seem." I fumbled with the keys outside Mystic Menagerie, my hands still quivering slightly from the strong coffee I'd chugged on the walk over. Eleanor had left a note taped to the door with detailed opening instructions, but actually doing it alone felt vastly different from just watching her yesterday. The lock clicked with a satisfying thud, and I pushed the door open to that familiar blend of earthy scents and that strange metallic tang. The creatures were already active, their morning sounds a symphony of chirps, scratches, and low rumbles. I flicked on the lights and checked my watch. 8:45 a.m. 15 minutes to get everything ready before the first customer arrived. I went through Eleanor's checklist, methodically register on, lights adjusted to the proper dim setting, and a quick walk around the enclosures to make sure nothing looked obviously amiss. The pocket next stretched its impossibly long neck and watched me pass, while the fur rhinos huddled together in their corner, their shimmering crimson fur catching the light. I kept my distance from the covered tanks, though their low thrum seemed louder this morning. At exactly 1900, the bell chimed. Morning. The man who entered moved with a quiet purpose, heading straight for a display case near the back wall that I hadn't really noticed yesterday. He was probably in his mid-40s, wearing a simple gray jacket and carrying a worn leather satchel. Everything about him screamed routine, the way he walked, the practiced nod he gave me, even how he pulled out his wallet before reaching the counter. I watched him select a large paper bag from the case. It was the kind you might use for groceries, except this one had "Weekly Essentials" written on it in Eleanor's neat handwriting. The bag looked heavy when he lifted it, and I caught a glimpse of bone, white shapes inside before he sealed the top. "That'll be $35, I said, checking the price list Eleanor had left by the register. He handed me exact change without a word, tucked the bag under his arm, and headed for the door. The entire transaction took less than 2 minutes. "Have a good one," I called after him, but he was already out. I scribbled the sale into Eleanor's ledger, noting the time and a brief description of the customer, just like she'd shown me, Thomas Vance. I found his name on a small customer list Eleanor had left, with a note that he was a Tuesday, 9 a.m. sharp kind of guy. The sheer efficiency of it all, after the previous day's oddness, was almost comforting. The rest of the morning drifted by quietly. I dusted around the enclosures, making a point to give the covered tanks a wide berth, and rearranged some of the supplies Eleanor kept hidden behind the counter. A few curious folks peered through the plate glass windows but never actually came inside, probably put off by the strange sounds seeping out. Around 10:30, the bell over the door jingled again. "Oh, hello there. You must be the new kid Eleanor mentioned." The woman who entered looked to be in her late 30s, with a sensible bob of brown hair and the kind of patient, understanding expression you often see on elementary school teachers. She moved slowly through the shop, pausing at each enclosure, examining the creatures inside with genuine, unfeigned interest. "Yeah, I'm Alex. Can I help you find anything? Just browse for now, sweetie. Take your time." She spent almost 20 minutes just wandering, occasionally cooing softly at the animals. I tried to look busy organizing receipts, but I kept one eye on her. Some of the creatures seemed more active when she was nearby, The pocket neck kept craning its absurdly long neck to follow her movements, and something in one of the covered tanks made a sound like a gentle set of wind chimes. Finally, she approached the section where Eleanor kept what she called traditional pets, though even these looked pretty far from your average house cat or poodle. The woman knelt in front of a large enclosure housing several coal black kittens, all of them looking identical save for tiny differences in size. "This little one," she said, pointing to the smallest kitten, "is just perfect." I opened the enclosure and carefully lifted out the tiny feline she'd indicated. It was surprisingly calm, settling into her arms without a peep of protest. She held it close to her chest, a soft smile spreading across her face. "His name is Shadow, aren't you?" "Shadow." The kitten purred, a sound that seemed much too loud for something so small. I rang up the sale, $45, which seemed reasonable for a kitten, and she paid with a credit card. While I processed the payment, I happened to glance at the sales ledger and noticed an entry from last Tuesday. Sarah Jenkins, 1 black kitten, for $45. I looked up at the woman cuddling her new pet. The same name was printed on the credit card in my hand. Sarah Jenkins had bought a kitten last week too. The urge to ask about it was strong. Had something happened to the first one? Was she starting a bizarre collection? But Eleanor's second rule echoed in my head: no questions about customers or their purchases. I completed the transaction in silence, printed her receipt, and handed over a small, ventilated carrier for the kitten. "Thank you so much, dear. Shadow and I are going to be very happy together." She left with the same patient smile she'd worn when she entered, the carrier swinging gently from her hand. I wrote the sale in the ledger and tried not to dwell on what might have become of the first Shadow. The afternoon brought a steady trickle of customers, each one stranger than the last. A teenager with bright purple hair bought 3 glass jars from a refrigerated display case, each one containing what looked like tiny, bioluminescent insects that zipped around inside like miniature fireflies. She paid with a $20 bill that felt oddly cold to the touch and hummed a strange, tuneless melody to herself as she left. An elderly woman shuffled in around 2 o'clock and spent several minutes meticulously examining a display case I hadn't noticed before. It held various feathers arranged on black velvet, some ordinary looking, others that seemed to shimmer and shift color when the light hit them just right. She selected a single golden feather from a section marked Sun, Phoenix Plume, and paid for it with 5 crisp $10 bills, handling the feather as if it were spun glass. The strangest transaction, however, came just before closing. A businessman in an impeccably tailored suit strode in and went straight to a shelf behind the counter that held dozens of small vials filled with different materials. Swirling colored liquids, what looked like crushed exotic leaves, and other substances I couldn't even begin to identify. He pointed to a vial containing what appeared to be utterly ordinary sand and waited while I checked the minuscule price tag. $50, I said, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. He handed me the money without a single question, tucked the vial into his sleek briefcase, and left with a brief, dismissive nod. I stared at the $50 bills for a moment before adding them to the register. Sand. $50 for what couldn't have been more than a few tablespoons of common beach sand. Each transaction felt normal in the moment: polite customers, standard payment methods, nothing overtly dangerous. But the cumulative effect left me feeling deeply unsettled. I wanted to ask Eleanor about the repeat kitten purchases, about why that sand cost $50, about what those glowing insects actually were. But every time the questions started to form in my mind, I remembered her grim expression when she'd laid out the rules. No questions about merchandise, customers, or shop operations. As closing time approached, a gnawing dread began to set in about the evening feeding. Yesterday, Eleanor had guided me through it, her calm presence making the weird routine feel manageable. Tonight I was on my own, with creatures that made unnerving sounds and covered tanks that hummed with unknown contents. I pulled out the feeding supplies and checked the laminated chart Eleanor had posted by the storage closet. Each creature had specific requirements, precise portion sizes, exact food types, and crucial timing. The instructions were detailed enough that I couldn't possibly make a mistake. But that also meant there was absolutely no room for shortcuts. I started with the familiar animals, keeping my eyes locked on the floor as I unlatched each enclosure. The pocket neck made a soft, rumbling sound when I dropped in its portion of tiny, shimmering leaves, but I didn't dare look up. The fur rhinos trumpeted excitedly as their food hit the floor of their enclosure, their small feet pattering as they rushed toward it. Some of the creatures made sounds I hadn't heard during yesterday's feeding. Something that looked like a cross between a ferret and a lizard hissed when I approached its tank, and I caught a quick glimpse of movement that was much faster than seemed natural. I dropped its food, small chunks of something that glowed faintly blue, and quickly snapped the latch shut. Another enclosure housed what Eleanor had called shadow cats, though they looked nothing like normal felines. They were completely black, as if carved from pure darkness itself, and they moved in ways that made my eyes ache trying to track them. When I opened their tank, they made a sound like crackling static electricity, and the air around the enclosure felt suddenly, unnaturally cold. I kept my head down, dropped their food, dried strips of something dark red, and moved on quickly, a shiver running down my spine. The covered tanks were, without a doubt, the worst part. As I approached the first one, the low thrumming grew louder, vibrating through the floor and straight into my bones. I lifted the edge of the thick cloth, just enough to drop in the required portion of raw, glistening meat, but something in the water moved with enough force to splash against the glass. The sound was off somehow, more like thick, viscous liquid than clear water. The second tank was silent until my hand brushed the cloth. Then something inside moved swiftly, creating waves that sloshed heavily against the sides. I dropped the food through the gap and quickly covered it again, my hands trembling slightly. The third and final covered tank made no sound at all, but when I lifted the cloth, the air that escaped smelled distinctly of ozone and burnt metal. I dropped the food, more of the glowing blue chunks, and heard it hit something solid rather than water. Whatever was in there wasn't swimming. I finished the feeding routine as quickly as possible, stored the supplies, and ran through Eleanor's closing checklist, locked the register, turn off most of the lights, double, check that all enclosures were properly sealed. The creatures settled into quieter evening sounds as the shop grew darker, though the covered tanks continued their persistent, low thrumming. At the front door, I paused to look back at the darkened shop. Indistinct shapes moved in the glass enclosures, and the covered tanks maintained their mysterious, unsettling chorus. I'd made it through my first day alone without breaking any rules. I'd handled transactions that defied any logical explanation and fed creatures that probably shouldn't even exist. I turned the lock and headed home, feeling a strange mix of accomplishment and deep unease. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring more peculiar customers, more inexplicable purchases, and more questions I couldn't ask. But I had proven to myself that I could follow Eleanor's rules, no matter how bizarre the situation became. That had to be enough. 2 weeks melted into the routine, and the rhythm of the shop had become almost second nature. I could navigate the morning opening without even glancing at Eleanor's notes, handle the stranger customers with practiced politeness, and complete the evening feeding without my hands shaking at all. The pocket neck no longer startled me when it stretched its impossibly long neck, and I'd learned to distinguish the unique sound each covered tank made during feeding time. I was munching on my lunch, a sad-looking sandwich, behind the counter watching the fur rhinos tumble playfully in their enclosure when the bell chimed earlier than usual. Eleanor walked in, her silver braids a little disheveled, and her expression more serious than I'd seen it since my very first day. "How are things running, Alex?" she asked, her eyes scanning the shop. "Good," I said, setting down my sandwich. "Thomas stopped by for his weekly essentials this morning, and Sarah bought another black kitten around 10:30. Same old routine." Eleanor nodded slowly, but her eyes kept moving around the shop, a careful, almost analytical gaze, as if she were searching for a problem. She walked over to the covered tanks, pausing at each one, listening intently to their low hums. Whatever she heard seemed to satisfy her, because her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. "Eleanor," I began, trying to keep my voice casual, "I've been wondering about those tanks." And some of the customers pay with such odd things. I mean, yesterday someone bought a vial of sand for $50, and last week, Alex. Eleanor's voice cut through my words like a sharp blade. She turned to face me, and the usual warmth that softened her features had vanished completely. What's the second rule? My stomach dropped. Don't question the merchandise, the customers, or how we run this place. That's right, she said, walking back to the counter, her movements precise and deliberate. I thought you understood why these rules exist. I do understand. I just thought maybe after 2 weeks? After 2 weeks? You should understand better than ever. Eleanor placed both hands flat on the counter and leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly. Curiosity might be harmless in most places, Alex, but not here. Not in this shop. Questions can be dangerous when you don't know what the answers might cost. I looked down at my half-eaten sandwich, feeling like a kid getting a stern lecture. The creatures around us seemed to have gone quiet, suddenly, as if they too were listening to the conversation. Some knowledge comes with a price. Eleanor continued, her voice gentler, but still firm. But some questions, once asked, can't be unasked. You've been doing so well following the rules. Don't let curiosity undo all that good work. She straightened up and checked her watch. I need to run some errands, but I'll be back before closing. Keep doing exactly what you've been doing, and remember the rules exist for specific reasons. Exactly. I finished, feeling a chill despite the warmth of the shop. Eleanor's expression softened just enough to show she wasn't angry, just deeply concerned. I'll see you later. After she left, I finished my lunch in silence, her words echoing in my mind. The shop felt different somehow, as if Eleanor's warning had reminded the creatures that I was still new, still learning. The pocket neck watched me with what seemed like heightened interest, and one of the covered tanks hummed with a different pitch than usual, a low, unsettling vibration that seemed to fill the very air around me. The afternoon crawled by until about 3 o'clock, when the bell chimed with a more aggressive jingle than usual. The man who entered moved like he was spoiling for a fight. His face was set in grim, hard lines, and his hands were clenched at his sides. He wore a dark, rumpled jacket over faded jeans, and every aspect of his posture screamed barely controlled fury. He marched straight to the counter and slammed a small cage down hard enough to make the register rattle. Inside was a hamster, unmistakably dead, lying on its side with its tiny legs stiff and unmoving. I want my money back. I looked at the cage, then up at his face. His eyes were cold and utterly demanding, fixed on me with an intensity that made every fiber of my being want to take a step back. But I held my ground and kept my voice level, the customer service training from my old retail jobs kicking in. I'm really sorry for your loss, sir, but we don't offer refunds or exchanges here. That's ridiculous! He practically spat, gesturing wildly at the deceased hamster. This thing died less than 6 hours after I bought it! You sold me a defective product? I pointed to the large, frame sign posted clearly by the register, the one Eleanor had made sure every customer would see. Our NOC, refund policy, is clearly displayed right there. All sales are final. His face darkened further, a shadow falling over his already hard features. I don't care what your sign says! This is unreasonable, and you know it. I paid $40 for a pet that dropped dead immediately. I understand you're upset, I said, trying to maintain a calm exterior even as my heart hammered against my ribs. But the policy applies to all sales, regardless of circumstances. Look, kid, he growled, leaning across the counter, bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. I'm not leaving here without my money. You can make this easy or you can make this difficult, but either way, I'm getting what I paid for. The creatures around us had gone completely silent. Even the covered tanks had stopped their low thrumming. The sudden, eerie absence of sound made his words seem louder, more menacing, filling the quiet space. I thought about Eleanor's urgent warnings, about rule number 3, about the dire consequences she'd mentioned for breaking any of the shop's sacred policies. Sir, I absolutely cannot process a refund. The policy is ironclad. Ironclad. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. You're being unreasonable. I could call the cops about this, report you for fraud, a business that sells dying animals to customers. My pulse quickened, but I forced my voice to remain steady. You're welcome to do whatever you feel is necessary, but I cannot and will not process a refund." He stared at me for a long, tense moment, his jaw working as if he were grinding words he desperately wanted to unleash. Around us, the shop remained unnaturally quiet, as if every single creature was holding its breath, waiting. "Fine," he finally spat. "You want to play hardball? We'll play hardball." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the counter deliberately, pressing it flat with his palm before sliding it toward me. "You'll regret this decision," he said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "Your choice has consequences you cannot imagine." He picked up the cage with the dead hamster and turned, walking toward the door. Just before stepping out, he twisted back, those cold eyes meeting mine. "Tonight," he said. "Remember that." The door slammed shut behind him, and immediately, the shop erupted back into its normal cacophony. Creatures chirped and scratched. The covered tanks resumed their unsettling thrumming, and the oppressive silence lifted like a heavy weight being removed from my chest. I stared at the folded paper for several seconds before my trembling fingers reached out to open it. Inside, written in red ink that looked darker, almost like dried blood, was a chilling message in neat, precise handwriting. "You will regret this decision tonight. Your choice has consequences you cannot imagine." My hands started shaking uncontrollably. I read the message 3 times, each word seeming to grow more ominous, more personal. This wasn't just an angry customer complaint. This felt like a threat, specific and deeply unsettling. I grabbed the old rotary phone and clumsily dialed Eleanor's number, my fingers fumbling over the buttons. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" Her voice was sharp, immediate. "A customer just left a threatening note." I stammered, the words tumbling out quickly. He wanted a refund for a dead hamster. And when I said no, he got aggressive and left this message about tonight and consequences. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice was piercingly sharp and urgent. "Alex, listen to me carefully. Lock up the shop right now. Don't wait until closing time. Don't finish any tasks. Lock the doors. Turn off the lights and go straight home. Lock all your doors and windows. Do not answer the door for anyone tonight, and do not leave your apartment for any reason." "Eleanor, what's going on? Who was that guy?" "Alex, just do what I'm telling you!" "Go home now and stay there. I'll explain everything tomorrow, but tonight, you need to follow my instructions exactly." I fumbled with my apartment keys, Eleanor's urgent words still echoing in my ears. The hallway outside my door felt too quiet, too empty, as if the entire building had been abandoned while I was at work. My hands trembled as I turned both locks, then slid the security chain into place. The threatening note was still in my jacket pocket, those stark red words burning into my memory. "Tonight. Remember that?" What in the world did that even mean? Eleanor's reaction had been so immediate, so intense, that I couldn't shake the feeling I'd stumbled into something far, far bigger than just an angry customer wanting his money back. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and meticulously checked every single window in my small apartment. Living on the second floor usually made me feel secure, but tonight, the rusty fire escape outside my living room window looked like a wide, open invitation for trouble. I yanked the curtains shut and checked the window locks, twisting them until they clicked firmly into place. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Stay inside. Don't answer the door. Call me if anything happens." I heated up some leftover pasta, trying desperately to distract myself with whatever was on TV. But every little sound from the hallway made me jump. Footsteps on the stairs, doors closing, the old elevator creaking, normal apartment building noises that suddenly felt loaded with potential danger. The threatening customer's face kept flashing in my mind, especially the way his eyes had gone utterly cold when I refused to process his refund. Around 8:00 p.m., I was washing dishes when something slammed into my living room window. Not a gentle tap or the sound of a bird flying into glass. This was a deliberate, heavy impact that rattled the entire frame and made the curtains shake violently. I froze, hands still submerged in soapy water, listening, holding my breath, waiting to see if it would happen again. Silence. Then came the chilling sound of glass cracking, slow and deliberate, like someone was applying steady, immense pressure from outside. I snatched a kitchen knife from the drying rack, gripping it tightly, and crept toward the living room, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The curtains shifted slightly, pushed by a sudden rush of cold air coming through what had to be a growing crack in the window. I could hear breathing from outside, heavy, labored, like someone who had climbed the fire escape quickly. Suddenly, the glass exploded inward. I threw my arm up to shield my face as jagged shards scattered across the living room floor. Through the gaping, broken opening came a leg, then a torso, and then the unmistakable figure of the angry customer from this afternoon. But something was horribly wrong with him. His skin had a grayish, mottled tint, uneven and dry like old, cured leather. When he straightened up and looked at me, his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface, like staring into empty, bottomless pits. He moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as if something else was learning to operate his body, still figuring out the controls. "You should have given me the refund," he said, but his voice had changed. It was still recognizably his, but layered with something else underneath, like two different people speaking in chilling unison. "Now the price is much higher." Behind him, through the shattered window, came shapes that made my brain struggle desperately to process what I was seeing. They moved like animals, but their limbs had too many joints, bending at angles that defied all logic and biology. Their skin was dark and wet-looking, covered with something that might have been fur, or might have been something else entirely, something living, squirming. When they opened their mouths, rows of needle, sharp teeth caught the apartment's dim light, glinting menacingly. I backed toward the kitchen, clutching the knife so tightly my knuckles went white. The creatures spread out across my living room floor with a predatory patience, making soft clicking sounds as their claws scraped against the hardwood. The rules weren't arbitrary. The thing wearing the customer's face said, stepping carefully over the broken glass. They were for protection. You chose to follow them, and now you get to experience what happens to those who refuse us. One of the creatures lunged. I swung the knife wildly, catching it across what might have been a shoulder. Black, viscous liquid sprayed across my arm, burning like acid where it touched my skin. The creature shrieked, a sound like metal being torn in half, and swiped at me with claws that were definitely not natural. A searing pain tore across my forearm as the claws ripped through my sweater and into flesh. Blood immediately soaked through the fabric, and I stumbled backward, hitting the kitchen counter with a painful thud. Another creature circled around my left side while the first one pressed forward, both of them making that horrifying clicking sound. I slashed at the second one and managed to drive it back, but the effort left me off balance, dizzy with pain. The first creature's claws found my face, opening 3 deep, parallel cuts from my temple all the way down to my jaw. Blood immediately ran into my left eye, making it hard to see anything clearly. The man, or whatever was controlling him, watched from near the broken window with those terrifying black eyes. He didn't participate in the attack, just observed with the kind of cold, clinical interest a researcher might show while watching lab animals. "This is what refusal costs," he said in that chilling doubled voice. "This is what happens when you choose rules over compromise." I backed against the refrigerator, waving the knife in front of me as both creatures advanced, their movements becoming more confident. My arm throbbed where the claws had torn through muscle, and blood from my face kept dripping onto my shirt, forming a growing red stain. The creatures moved with increasing assurance, as if they could smell my weakening resolve, my ebbing strength. Just as I felt my legs starting to buckle from blood loss, my front door exploded inward. Eleanor burst through the splintered wood, carrying a small, worn cloth bag. Her silver braids flew behind her, and her face was set in grim, unyielding determination. She plunged a hand into the bag and threw handfuls of what looked like shimmering silver powder at the nearest creature. The effect was immediate and devastating. Where the powder touched the creature's skin, it began to smoke and dissolve like salt on a slug, but at an incredibly accelerated rate. The creature's shriek rose to an almost unbearable pitch before it collapsed into a bubbling pool of black, steaming liquid. Eleanor threw more powder at the second creature, which tried to flee toward the broken window. The silver dust caught it halfway across the room, and it dissolved just as completely as the first one, leaving only a dark, sticky stain on my hardwood floor. The possessed man collapsed. His body hit the ground with the solid, sickening thump of dead weight, and when I looked at his face, his eyes had returned to normal. Normal, but utterly lifeless. Whatever had been controlling him was gone, leaving behind just a corpse that looked exactly like the angry customer who had demanded a refund 6 hours ago. Eleanor knelt beside me, her hands moving quickly over my injuries with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she'd done this many times before. She examined the deep claw marks on my arm, the cuts on my face, checking for depth and damage.